Citizens of the world, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast where we try and keep a few more dollars in your pocket. Today we are talking about what can be a very sensitive subject for a lot of people, but also one that we all at some point in our lives confront. And it's the question of, is it better to buy or rent? And anytime I'm having this discussion with anyone, there's a lot of emotion involved in it. And emotion and solid decision making usually don't go together. And there's other important factors that play into that as well, which is lifestyle, what you want, why is the main question that I'm always asking. Why do you want to buy? And if the number one reason that you want to buy is fear of missing out, then that's usually not a good reason to buy. And I will tell you that home ownership, rental property, whatever it is, if it's an investment, there's effort involved. Pretty much the only investments that I make that require no involvement are really buying index funds, because those are easy. And 401k investment is basically the same thing. But when it comes to alternative types of investments, if you don't watch out for your money, somebody else will be watching out to take it. That's an unfortunate part of the free market system. So when we're talking about whether or not we want to buy a home or whether or not we want to pay rent, we need to really think about this on a long-term basis. So right out of the gates, if you buy a house, you're behind 6%. And the reason you're behind 6% is because that's what it costs you to sell your house just in fees. So you're going to pay 6% to real estate agents. That doesn't include your time to do all of the extra work needed to prep the house so that you can try and get out a slightly higher sales price. That doesn't include all the repairs and maintenance that you may have to pay to make the house show well so it will sell, again, at a price that you want. It doesn't include a whole lot of other efforts that you're going to make during the transaction to buy and then also the transaction to sell. So before we even get to any of that, the first question is this strictly a financial choice? Are you just looking for a financial answer? Are you looking for a yes, no, is it a wise investment? Or is it the best investment is often the question that I get. Is buying a home the best investment that I can make? And here's an example where I will say absolutely not. Usually my first question at that is, okay, well, how much disposable income do you have to invest? And then followed up with the question of, okay, if you're offered a 401k plan at your work, are you taking advantage of that? Especially if there's an employer match percentage. Are you contributing to make sure that you get that employer match? Because if not, that's free money. And free money is the best kind of money to make. So are we talking about, hey, we're looking for something where we're just trying to get a return on our investment? Or are we looking at it from a different scenario? And before we can even get into that, sometimes people will ask me, this happens over and over and over, like, what do I invest in? And then I'll ask them, how much money do you have to invest? I don't have any money right now. But when I get some money, what should I invest in? I tell them, you don't need to worry about what to invest in. And again, that answer is real simple from, the Warren Buffett perspective. Invest in low-cost mutual funds. Just call it that. Or low-cost index funds and leave it alone. But where's the money coming from? If you don't have money to invest, and similarly, if you don't have the ability to make a down payment, if you don't have the ability to, because you have poor credit, to get financed, then why are we discussing whether or not you want to buy a home? First, you need to fix those things. So assuming those things are fixed and assuming that you can buy a home, do you want to? Are you the type of person that wants to and is okay with dealing with things when they break? Because part of home ownership is home breakership and home fixing ship. All of those things. You're going to spend more time than you ever want dealing with issues of your home. Whether that's mowing the lawn or wait till the sprinkler system freezes and you get to dig trenches and fix that. Wait till the fence is falling down and you get to post hole in some new fence posts. That's a real fun time. How much time are you going to spend taking care of that home? How much money are you going to spend at Home Depot and on new appliances and on updates and upgrades and on just routine maintenance? Do you want to do all those things? Or is your time better spent elsewhere? Do you have other options for your money? So when I was in my 20s, I actually tried to buy a home very early on, right out of school, probably about a year out. I tried to buy a 2-bedroom condo. And it's probably would have been a decent investment over the long term. In many ways, I'm glad that it didn't work out. But I couldn't get financed because I didn't make enough money at the time. 3 degrees, doesn't matter. They want to see cash flow. Oh, you've worked for a year, that kind of, but you don't really make enough just yet. Wait till you get another raise, then come back to us. And 2 years later, by the time I did have that raise and I did have some money that I could have done with, I decided that I wanted to save my money because I wanted to be able to invest in businesses, and that a return on a home value probably wasn't as much as I was going to get out of business. I had other friends making different decisions. And some of us talked about this quite a bit. Like, what should we do? Should we buy a house? Should we not? Do we want to be, can I afford the neighborhood that I want to live in? Or am I going to end up buying in a place where I can afford, which is not the neighborhood I really want to live in, which means it's not really buying a home. It's really buying an investment property for a long term that I plan to rent out in a few years. Lots of different things going on. So lots of things to consider before we just say, hey, I should buy a home, because, in large part, because we say that's the American dream. But let's remember, it's not what you see, it's what's paid for. And what I see happening, if you look at people's Facebook and Instagram accounts, is they close on a home, meaning they owe the bank, and especially if they put a small percentage down, they put 3% down and they go, I'm a homeowner. No, you're not. You are the holder of debt on a home, and if you pay off that debt, then you will be the homeowner. But until that debt is paid, that house is not yours. That house belongs to the bank, and they allow you to stay there as long as you keep making payments. And that is true until the final payment is made. And you have to pay all your real estate taxes, or else you can lose your home if you don't pay those. And you have to pay your insurance, or else you can lose your home because of that too. So if you don't pay all the bills, it's not your house very, very quickly. So we need to be very frank in our discussions about, is this home ownership? Do we own this, or are we just allowed to reside there as long as we make the payments? Now, if we make all the payments, then it is ours. And there's something to that, because over time, and if we look at the historical, home prices went up directly with inflation. So as things cost more, which makes a lot of sense, because if you think about it in terms of what was the cost of the land, and what was the cost of the materials, and what was the cost of the labor to build it, if all of those things increase in price, and that's inflation, then the price of the home that already exists goes up, because the price to replace that home goes up because labor's more expensive, land's more expensive, and materials are more expensive. So that makes really logical sense. And over most of the last 100 years, that was the case, that the arc of increase in home value, appreciation, was the same as inflation. Now, over the last 20 years, those curves have gotten really, really skewed, and depending on which market and supply and demand, and because of the recession that we had, not enough homes got built, so then all of a sudden there's a shortage of supply in a lot of neighborhoods, and therefore costs go up because of supply-demand economics, not just because of normal things. So then we go, is that sustainable over the long term? Or right now, are we in an asset bubble where, because interest rates are so low, that all of a sudden prices are really high? Lots of things to consider. And if we're looking at this strictly from a financial perspective, we're going to end up making a lot of assumptions. So the other real thing to consider is this is lifestyle choices. Am I choosing to buy because of my family situation, i.e. I'm starting a family, so I want to have a home in a neighborhood where I feel comfortable with my kids going to school? Or am I buying a home because that's actually where I want to live? I can tell you in my personal circumstance, the reason that I bought the home that I ended up with, and I did not buy my first home until my mid-30s. But the reason that I chose it was location, location, location. It's in an ideal location for me, for a lifestyle, for what I want to do and where I want to be most of the time. So those are huge things. Because otherwise, and this is what I did in my younger years, because I knew that I wanted to take that money that I had that I could buy a home with. And some would say I should have bought a home with, but now I have a business instead. So really, is that truly the case? I don't think so. I'm pretty happy with how things worked out, and you never know. And if I would have invested all that money in a home, I might not have had money to pull out to invest in the businesses. So the other option is, why not just find cheap rent? And by I mean find cheap rent, I don't mean call the 10 different apartment complexes and ask them what their current price is and go move into the lowest one. I mean find some people who have rental properties, who hold them for the long term, who appreciate long-term tenants, who will take care of the place, and find that place. And that's going to take some effort too, but the payoff's huge. I've done this most of my adult life, finding places that go up for rent, talking to friends about different places. The place that I've been in the longest, I found because of a friend. And they said, hey, I got a friend, he's subleasing from this other guy right now, but he's got to move because he got a new job and he can't commute. So he's moving, so that place is going to come available. You should call this guy. And I called this guy for like 9 months. And finally got into that place. And worked out, cheap rent, couldn't have been better. And that cheap rent is way less than it would have been to own, which allowed me to save a bunch more money to invest in businesses. So other things that may impact you. Again, we talked about right out of the gates. You buy a home, you want to go sell it because you got a job in a different place, you're going to lose 6%. So are you going to live there long enough for it to appreciate at least 6%? That's just break even. Or do you value the flexibility and the advantage that, hey, I can move whenever I want? And again, if you find that lower cost rent, typically that lease is month to month after the first year, which gives you amazingly flexible options of, hey, I only have 30 days notice. I can walk away. I can move wherever I want if the right opportunities come up in my life. And when you're young, that may be important. Now, if you have decided that you want to live in a specific place and you are there, then maybe that's not a consideration for you. And maybe you're saying, hey, I'm staying for the long term, so this is a good investment for me. And I'm not trying to persuade you one way or the other. What I like to do is try and get both sides of the argument. So whether this is a business proposition, whether I'm sitting at a bank, I always like to get both sides. I want to know everything about my options. And then I can make an informed decision. So I'm not here to persuade you one way or the other that buying is better or renting is better. Depending on your situation, either could be true. Because the answer to should I buy or should I rent is, as usual, it depends. Because it does depend on your situation. It depends on why you want to buy. So if you can find a low-cost rental and invest the difference, you might be better off. And we're going to go through a worksheet that's going to kind of show us, well, what if some of these assumptions are different? Then what? Do I have the time to deal with the home? And it's the same for rental properties. When people ask me, hey, do you think rental property is a good investment? Do you want to deal with the call that the garbage disposal is leaking, or the pipes are leaking or clogged, or the toilet's running, or whatever the problems are of a rental property? Do you want to get those phone calls? I still don't own rental properties for this specific reason. I can't be bothered. I have a business to run. I can't be called at Tuesday at 9 a.m. and somebody say, hey, the sink's broken and I need you to come fix it, or find somebody to deal with it. I can't deal with that problem. I'm running a company. I need to deal with those problems. And so that's not a good return on investment of my time to do that. Now, if you've got a couple of rental properties or that's what you're inclined to do, or you're kind of handy, those things may be for you. But again, even owning a home, do I want to deal with repairs and maintenance? If I don't, then sometimes renting is a better option because I get my time back for those things. And how do we value that? It's hard to. So I already talked about this. Can we get financed for a home loan? Do I have enough for a down payment? Do I have credit? If not, then I can keep learning about it, but I'm not in the discussion right now. I need to start saving. So if we move on to the buy or rent discussion, then we go, okay, we need to collect information. So what information do we need to do our financial analysis of renting versus buying? We need to know what the target home price would be, what the rent would be if I choose to rent instead of buy. We have to guess at what the appreciation of the home will be. We're going to have to collect interest rate, know how long of a loan we're looking for. Are we looking at a 30-year loan, which is typical, and what's the interest rate on that right now based on your credit, based on your down payment? So if you've got less than a 20% down payment, then you're going to have to pay mortgage insurance, PMI. And how much is that going to cost you? What are the property taxes of the place? And what's the property value of the property taxes based on? And you can look that up from the county. And the reason that I say this is because as soon as you buy the home, the county and the city are going to mark up the value of that home to the actual sales price, because that is the value of the home. It's a value of a home is what it just sold for, obviously. And so taxes are likely to rise on the property. And that's one that's often missed. You need to call your insurance agent and ask what the insurance cost is going to be on that home. And typically they'll require an address, but you can get an estimate from them fairly easy. You need to estimate repairs and maintenance expense. And if you already have a home that you've looked at, you've probably already decided some of the things that you would like to do to change that home. So how big is that Home Depot bill going to be? How many appliances are you replacing and when? And however long you think the current ones are going to last, they're not going to last that long. I had a fridge that was probably 8 or 9 years old that died last year. I wasn't expecting to replace that. That one hurt in the budget a little bit. So appliances can cost a lot of money, and especially now that they're electronic, they can die anytime they feel like. And we need to know our tax rates, and we need to estimate what average market return would be on our money if we chose to invest it in the stock market versus a home. So, does it currently cost less to own than to rent? And typically it doesn't. Typically it costs less to rent than it does to own. And this gets flipped upside down in different markets. So one of the things that we have to realize about real estate markets is real estate markets are not like the stock market where it's about national growth. Real estate markets are very, very local. So the real estate market in San Francisco, for example, and New York City are very different than what's going on in Kansas City, Missouri, where home prices aren't going up. And in New York, they're actually going down, but in San Francisco, they're going up. If you want to move to one of the hot spots right now, if you want to move to Austin or Boise or Salt Lake or Denver, costs are going up, 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 up. So this is always an interesting question, but literally on a today-to-day basis, because when you add in all the costs, then you go, oh, is it actually cheaper right now to rent than it is to own? And typically it is, but I also have seen other markets where because there's a lot more people who can't get financed right now because they have poor credit, student loan debt, credit card debt, all the rest of it, don't have money for down payments, so they can't afford to buy the home, they have to pay rent. And they're paying more in rent than they would cost them to buy. But if there's not a lot of people, again, supply-demand economics for any particular market will determine this. So the other question is this going to change in the future? And this could be one, like I ask this question in Denver all the time. They're building apartments like crazy. So if I go buy an apartment with the assumption that the rent that I'm able to, and let's just talk about it from an investment perspective versus, because the finance discussion of should I buy or should I rent is much easier done on a comparative basis, not of do I want to live in the home necessarily, but what if I just bought it as a rental property? If you're going to live there, the cost is the cost. But what if I buy an apartment now, and I'm assuming that over the long term I'll be able to increase what I charge in rent? Well, what if they build more apartments? I will make it harder to sell my apartment because there'll be newer ones that maybe they cost the same now to build. Or if they've overbuilt, then the cost of the big apartment complexes, they're able to drop their price, even if they lose money, because they've got backing of big, big dollars. Versus if you start losing money every month on a property, and typically when you buy an investment property, you often do lose money because, again, it's more expensive to own than it is to rent. Short term. Long term, that usually flips over unless you just happen to buy into a market that went really, really south, where people are moving out and there's no one to buy a home. Like example, if you're in Wyoming right now in a coal community and the jobs are going away because they're closing down the coal plants because natural gas is so cheap, it's going to be really hard to sell your home. Will the market continue to appreciate? Markets have had a really long, big run, and wages have not kept up with the increase in housing costs. So will you be able to sell that house at a profit? Don't know. It's never a for sure. And everyone thinks, and this was what caused our Great Recession, was the idea that housing prices could ever fall was crazy, but yet they have. So will the market continue to appreciate? We don't know. None of us can see the future. So then is it really cheaper to buy than rent, even if the cost is the same? Can we include all the costs? Or do we have our repairs and maintenance in there? Property taxes going up? PMI if we don't have the 20% down payment? What are all the other factors that I'm not thinking about, that you are not thinking about, that is it really cheaper to buy? On the long term, we think, and we assume, because this is usually the case, inflation happens, prices rise, and therefore if you can lock in your rent at a set price, then all of a sudden you're saving money because the current rental income, the future rental income will cost much more than your mortgage will. And that's often true in the long term. That's one of the long-term reasons to buy, is you're locking in your lower rate of rent. Can I rent a room long-term or short-term on Airbnb to make the costs different? But this argument works both ways, because you can go, well, I can get a roommate and get a 2-bedroom apartment, and that'll be cheaper for me than living by myself. So having roommates works rent or buy in terms of lowering your cost. And we all know this. That's why when you're young, you have roommates, of course, because it costs less. So the analysis of this changes all the time. So it's the what if I get a roommate analysis. Like I just said, we could, use those in either analysis. There's going to be a lot of unknowns. So we're never going to get to a complete answer. We're never going to say we know what appreciation is going to be in any particular market. In fact, depending on if you have to move or if you want to move or if you're trying to get out at a certain time, you may end up losing money. It's very possible. We just don't know what the future is. So we make a lot of assumptions, but at the end of the day, we're making our best case scenario guess on what's the best thing for us. We don't know what long-term interest rates are going to do. Now, I would guess that they're going to stay very low for a very long time, because if the government increases them, they increase the amount of money they have to pay on the deficit. Also, if interest rates rise, the value of your home goes down because there's not going to be enough people that can afford it. Because every point of interest rate increases typically will reduce the purchasing power for the person buying it by 10%. So if interest rates right now are at 3% and they go to 5%, and you think your home's worth $1 million, that person that would have been able to buy your home for $1 million if rates are at 3%, at 5%, that person can only afford $420,000. It means there's a lot less people that can afford your home at $500,000. So when we look at this run up in prices, There's a bunch of factors in play here. One of them is the Airbnb factor, which says that I can now buy that place, rent it out on a daily basis, and make a lot more money than renting it out on a monthly basis. That makes the value of that property more, which is why you see cities coming back saying, we're not going to allow this, because it's driving up monthly rental costs for all of us. And that's a fair argument, and I agree with that. You shouldn't be able to do that, especially since we have licensing, and that's what we have hotels for. These are nightly rentals, and we have licensing for that, and this is monthly rentals so that people can afford to live. But when we mix the two, we have problems. And that's why you see so many homeless people in California. A lot of those people have jobs. They literally just can't afford rent because it's so high, because the rest of us vacationing there can afford to pay Airbnb rates. And that nightly rate's a lot more than the monthly rate. So interest rates matter. Market dynamics matter. The other reason we've had a run up in prices is because interest rates have dropped. So again, people can afford more. So as interest rates drop from 6% to 3%, people can afford to buy more home. And they have. Can it go the other way? That worries me. The other question is, what about other investments? So if I'm looking at this as a comparative basis to what's the smart thing to do financially, well, what's the rate of return on your other investments? And will that be consistent? And for some of that, we can use a long term. We've got 100 years of S&P 500 returns averaging 8%, And then here's another question to ask yourself. Suppose that if you invest the difference, and we're going to talk about this, investing the down payment, for example, and then the difference in if rent's cheaper every month than the mortgage, and so I decide to rent. Well, I take that delta, I take the difference and invest it every month. Do I trust myself to do that? If I don't, then maybe a home's a good long-term solution because it's forced long-term savings, because I got to make that rent payment to keep the house. So there's a lot of things to consider here. This is a very complicated analysis in many parts. And a lot of it comes down to, can I afford it? And what decisions are best for my lifestyle and what I want to do? So your decision is going to come down to a lot of, it should depend on your specific situation, your lifestyle choices. Are you willing to pay extra for location, and can you afford that? Do you prefer the flexibility and just focus on finding cheaper rent because you don't want to deal with all the hassles of home ownership? You don't want to mow the lawn. You don't want to take care of things. You don't want to be responsible when things break. Is this a family decision about where we want to raise our kids and where we want them to go to school? Because that can be obviously extremely important. Do I have the time and inclination to handle home ownership responsibilities? Is it just smart financially? Well, smart financially, as you've seen, is a very complicated discussion. And I'm going through this very, very quickly. These are conversations that you need to think, questions you need to think about, of the whys and the whats and the hows and the whos that are over a long period. Now, this shouldn't be a 30-minute analysis of, should I buy or should I rent? I should rent. I should buy. It shouldn't be that quick of an answer. It should be asking all the questions, assembling all this information, thinking about it and going, this is the best answer for me, and going with your gut feel on it. Because is it a smart financial decision? Well, that depends. Can you afford it? Do you have the credit and the down payment? Do you barely have enough? If you only have enough for a down payment, should you be buying a home? And I would tell you shouldn't. Because if you lose your job next month, and that's possible, then you don't have enough to continue to make payments for another 6 or 8 months while you figure it out. If you don't have enough for something to break immediately, you don't have enough money for fixing up what you're going to want to right away. What about furnishing the place? And if we don't have money beyond our down payment for all of these things, then what do we typically end up doing? Taking on credit card debt, which is much higher interest debt. It's not good. So, best use of money, best use of time. Questions for you. Did I build in enough for increases in taxes, repairs, etc.? Because while we want our home to appreciate, guess what happens when it appreciates? We have to pay more in taxes. What about insurance? What about if you live in California right now and you bought your home 5 years ago, but now all of a sudden the fires are going crazy? And in fact, California just made it illegal for insurance companies to pull out and not offer you insurance because a lot of the insurance companies are going, wait, the risk of fire is huge. And you're going to see state-backed policies very, very soon, similar to the same thing that we have in Florida for hurricane insurance. None of the major insurance companies are going to insure you. So depending on the area you live in, your insurance costs could go up dramatically. Do you have the flexibility to handle changing situations? And are you going to be happy with this decision over the long term? That's questions that I can't answer for you. All those things matter. Once we get past all of those things, then we can get into the real details of looking at the math of this situation. So I'm going to pull up a document here that's a template that I built a long time ago, and I just updated it because the buyer rent discussion changed a lot in terms of the financial impact on taxes. So previously, when the standard deduction was about $2,500 to $3,500 a year, all of a sudden there was a huge tax benefit for interest and property taxes and filing an itemized deduction return. Now they've increased the standard deduction, so that's not the same. So now we're going to get into the financial analysis part of this. And this goes into all of the assumptions we just talked about. So everything in yellow in this worksheet is an assumption. So the assumption I used for the house is the average price of a home in America. The down payment that I put in here is 20%. The interest rate is about what I think it would be. Now, that's going to depend on your credit, so that's got to be adjusted accordingly. We also have property taxes, PMI if we're putting down less than 20%, insurance, and cost of repairs every year. And I would tell you that $1,000 a year for repairs is absolutely silly because you'll probably spend that amount of money on paint alone the first year. Between paint, brushes, buckets, tape, you could easily spend $1,000. So, but on a $226,000 house, we're putting in estimates here. We're also putting in an estimate of rent. And what we find is the yearly cash out, and we go, okay, are we receiving a tax benefit? So this is where this has really changed, where it used to be that there was a tremendous tax benefit to home ownership, and now that's almost completely gone. So in a house of this size, if this was true, if property taxes were $1,500 and your interest was about $5,800, then you're not even going to itemize deduct based on that, unless your state taxes is huge. So unless your property taxes are really big, unless some number jumps out crazy, there's not a huge tax benefit any longer to the first home purchase. Now, as your income rises, you pay more state income tax, unless your property taxes and income taxes go over $10,000 a year. Now all of a sudden you could end up in that sweet zone where it makes sense. But then you get to married and your standard deduction doubles. So there's not a whole lot of tax benefit to owning a home anymore. Also, this is your monthly rent. Based on this kind of home price in this market, I would say you're not hustling enough. You could reduce that. And we've got our rate of return. So let me explain a little bit of how this worksheet works. So I have this home price and this down payment. So when we're talking about from a financial only perspective, do I take this money, put this down payment down to own this home, or do I take this money and invest it, assuming that I have the money available? Well, if I invest it, that's going to give me a rate of return, right? And that's going to grow. So if this is a 30-year mortgage, or I really have this set up as an interest only, but 30 years of payments. So I'm going to do own it for 30 years or I'm going to invest it for 30 years. So we can do an apples to apples financial comparison on buy versus rent. Now, here's the real unknown, and that's the home appreciation rate. Because if the home appreciation rate goes up to, say, 10%, then that home that you paid $220,000 for in 30 years is worth $3.5 million. Now, unless you bought a home in San Francisco or somewhere in California on a beach, in a small town that's now growing like crazy because maybe there didn't used to be a town and access was hard, or maybe 30 or 40 years ago you bought a place in Vail before they built I-70 through there and put in the ski mountains. Unless you have some anomaly, the odds that the increase is going to go from $220,000 over 30 years to $3.5 million for the same home are probably pretty small. So when we see these home appreciation rates at 10% year over year, they'll go for a few years, but then it becomes unsustainable. So again, as I said, over the long term, it's matched inflation. But over the short term, 5 to 10 year period, and what we've seen in California is it go way up, drop off a cliff, and now it's gone way up again, where it really prices again seem kind of bubbly, right? And so if you're looking at this decision today and you're going, should I buy or should I rent today? There's a few more concerns that you may have about the market. So all of these assumptions go into determining whether or not the value of your investment versus what you're going to end up getting back from that house over 30 years. And we're speaking strictly financial terms because we can't put a true value on, oh, I had a home where I could raise my children where they got to live their entire youth and go to good schools and, have a good neighborhood. That's tough to put a value on financially, right? But if we're just looking at the financial discussion of, and you could think of this as another way, should I buy a rental property or should I just invest my money? This is what the rental property would return me over the next 30 years, or this is what me just investing my money would do over the next 30 years because I wouldn't take this big chunk and put it as a down payment. And if that's a rental property, you probably have to put 30% down. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to talk about leverage a lot. And leverage is the reason that sometimes buying a home is really worth it. And especially if you're a first-time home buyer, if you have good credit and you can get away with 3% down and the PMI doesn't kill you, it can be a really good opportunity over the long term. But if we just looked at this from strictly math and strictly finance, because of course, what happens if I say, okay, I'm willing to have a roommate, so I'm willing to reduce that cost, right? And get a 2-bedroom apartment versus this is a 1-bedroom condo. So if I'm going to go to a 2-bedroom condo and get some rent, I might have to increase this price. Do I have enough for a down payment? There's so many ins and outs, which is why I built a worksheet for it. So you can scenario it for yourself. What if you think it's going to cost you $5,000 a year in repairs year over year? Or what if you could pay that cheaper rent? What if you live in Pennsylvania and your property taxes are crazy high? Well, your rent's probably not going to be as cheap because the other landlord's got to pay those property taxes too. So many things to consider. But if we look at a couple of these situations, we get down and we go, hey, in 30 years, the value of my investments, if I was able to keep my rent this cheap. And again, rent's probably going to rise. So then I'm going to go, okay, what's my average rent? So say my rent's $800 today, and it's going to go up slowly over the next 30 years. Or what if I actually went to a landlord today and I said, hey, I want to sign a 30-year lease with you. And this is what happens on commercial property all the time. You see a new Taco Bell or McDonald's go in. Ray Kroc used to say, I'm not in the business of selling burgers, I'm in real estate. And he knew that over the long term, the value of that real estate was going to be the real value of what was left of that business because anyone can sell burgers. So what's that average monthly rent going to be over the long term? Is it really going to be $800? What if it's $950? What if, interest rates can't go a whole lot lower than that, but what if you could get a 2.5% interest rate instead? What if instead of returning 7%, it only returned 5%? We get completely different answers down here. What if my home appreciated at 4% instead of 3%? That $200,000 house becomes worth $700,000 in 30 years? Possible, depending on the market that you're in. Also possible it doesn't appreciate at all. So what happens if this is zero? And when you go to sell your house, it's worth the exact same thing you bought it for. Then you'd be much better off investing that money right now. So if you're in a market you're not really sure about, a lot of times it is better to rent. But those are often the markets where it's cheaper to buy than to rent because everybody else thinks the same thing. So they're going to try and sell that property and get out while they can. So we have all of these assumptions that we have to play with in our mind to go, is this the right financial situation for me? And that's why I'm telling you that the most important thing when we look at this is your situation. So first, do you have the money to do it? Do you have good credit where it makes sense? Are you financially stable with your job and have some savings and some additional money besides just that down payment? Or, is there other ways? Because we say, hey, I could reduce this monthly rent. Well, I could also reduce my monthly payment here. What if I could get somebody else to pay me $1,000 a month for rent for the other room in the house? Then I have no cash out. Then it's a great deal. And of course I should probably do it. But what if you can't? Or what if you don't want to? What if that's not the situation you're in? What if you're in a family situation where the cost of the house is $500,000 and the equivocal rent that you'd pay for a home that you would want for your family is $2,300? So you've got to save $100,000 for the down payment. Maybe your interest rate's a little bit higher. Maybe your cost of repairs is $2,500 a year, but maybe your insurance is a little bit more. Maybe your property taxes are a little bit more. So maybe your cash out is still less than it is for rent. I don't know until you run through this. And again, this is interest only. So, hey, this is pretty close. So for the value for my family, if that's pretty close, then maybe we want the home because that's going to be a better environment for us. And so here we go. Now, if I take the same scenario and all of this data is just pulled off the other worksheet, and I went, oh, wait, we reduced that rate of return. So what if this rate of return goes up to 7%? Hey, now buying a home is actually more advantageous because the home value went up 3%, and what it would have cost me to rent it was a lot higher. So now that's a better situation. So the next part of this worksheet is buying with a payoff of the loan. And the reason that I did it separately is because when you pay off a loan, every month part of your payment, your payment's bigger, right? So if you just did this one, this is interest only. That's what it says up here. Buying a house, but it's interest only loan. And so that means that basically $400,000 you're going to pay at 3%. It's going to be $12,000 a year you're going to pay in interest, okay? This is basically your monthly cost for your home versus paying rent. When we buy the home, and typically we're not going to get as low an interest rate when we do interest only, or it'll have a short term on it. And so again, interest rates rise, everything changes. When we pay off a loan, we're paying principal and interest. So now all of a sudden that monthly payment for principal and interest is much higher. Plus we have to pay the property taxes, plus we're paying the insurance every month. So the cost of all those things gets wrapped in and go, oh, well, that's my monthly payment is pretty close to my monthly rent. But here's the big difference. I had to invest that down payment and I'm not getting a return on that down payment. It's basically sitting in what amounts to a savings account that is my property. Now, again, over 30 years, if this rent rises, then that may be a better deal for you, right? But in this particular case, if this was the scenario and this is what you had to pay every year and your house value appreciated 3%, then at the end of 30 years and you paid off your home and you could sell it, it's worth $1.2 million. Okay. And actually, we don't need to ask this question anymore. But if you would have invested that $100,000 and you invested the difference, which is actually it's significant, right? So here's your annual spend difference. If your rent is less than the cost to own the home, right? And you get a rate of return on that every year, and that grows for 30 years, and your original investment grows for 30 years, you'd be almost twice as well off renting versus buying. But again, there's a lot of assumptions in there. So we're assuming this monthly rent didn't increase, which again, if you go get a 30-year lease from the guy who bought the house right now, he might give you that because, again, you're paying off his mortgage for him. So to him, that might seem like a good deal. Who knows? So there's a lot of factors, a lot of scenarios in here, and probably a lot of people may get lost in these worksheets, but this is the way that it works if we're doing it financially. And this is why I say, when it comes back to it, the major factors in whether or not you should or shouldn't purchase a home. And you could use these worksheets more as an investment tool from an investment perspective. How many rental properties do I want to get invested in versus am I better off in the market? And the interesting thing is, from a diversification standpoint, it kind of makes sense because if you just put all your money in the market tanks and you could lose a bunch of your money, and especially as you get closer to retirement. Typically with rental properties in most markets that don't end up with crazy appreciation, which we've only seen recently and I believe have more to do with supply and demand and government intervention. So the state of California, for example, makes it very expensive for permitting to build houses. They make it really hard to build, which makes it expensive, which means housing prices go up. So it's a secondary impact of bad government regulation. But what happens if government rolls back those regulations and makes it easier to build more properties? Then all of a sudden the supply of properties will increase, demand will drop, and the value of your home could significantly decrease. I believe that there's going to be a strong case for that in Denver in the next couple of years because they've built so many apartments. There's so many rental properties that I believe over the long term of the next few years, I think prices are going to come down because there's too much supply. Now, over the next 40 years, that supply may work out and may level off. But short term, I think that that's the case. I could be wrong. Could be completely wrong. If everyone keeps moving to Colorado, then I'm going to be wrong because then the demand stays high and then there's not enough supply. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. But again, do I have a different use of this money? Now, what if I said, hey, instead of having $100,000 that I'm going to put down on a rental property or a home for myself, what if I could take that same $100,000 and invest it in my business and grow my business? And what if I could get a business rate of return that's not 7%? What if I could get a business rate of return that's 20%? And what if I could get my monthly rent, because I really worked on it, down to $1,500 for that same $500,000 home? Because I found one that somebody's been renting for the last 15 years and they just want to keep it as a long-term rental and they just don't want to deal with it. So they're willing to rent it to me long-term because I take care of it a little bit better. I pay lower monthly rent. Over the long term, the cash out that I'm going to pay in rent versus someone buying the home and the appreciation of that, I could end up a whole lot better off. Even though, why did this? This is interesting. So a $500,000 home, but my rent went down and all of a sudden it cost me more in rent. This is just for interest expense. No, cash out. Interest on $400,000 at 3% is $12,000. $2,500 in repairs, insurance, property taxes, $18,500. Oh, because there's a tax benefit here for the interest in property taxes. So this is actually where this gets very interesting. The lower the cost of the home, if you don't have enough in interest expense and property taxes, then you don't see a benefit from the change in tax law. But all of a sudden here we have totalized itemized deductions of 1875, which gives us a bunch of money we're receiving the tax benefit on, which means that now all of a sudden it is cheaper. But let's say that that cost was the same for sake of argument. So we're not losing any money there. And I'm able to get 20% long-term return on my business investment. That's a huge amount of money. Now it's giving me 20% down here as well. But I could change that one to back to 7. And it's still using the old one. So I got to change this scenario. I'm not going to mess with this. Here's the number I wanted you to look at. The house value. Well, none of these equations seem to be working out in this particular scenario. I'm not sure what happened to my worksheet. I think I broke it. So let's fix it. So we got a $500,000 house that appreciates at 3%. At the end of 30 years, it becomes worth more than I'm not sure why that happened. I got to fix this. But my point, I'll come back to this and then I'll fix the worksheet so when you go in to use it that it works correct for you. My point is if I could take that down payment and get a net rate of return over 30 years, that's a huge, huge, huge increase, right, of value from growing a business versus owning a home, where I'm not going to see, very likely impossible to see, a 20% year over year annualized rate of return, right? It's just not going to happen. So if that's the case, then the value of my investments could grow to millions versus not. So think about it this way. If you were living in San Francisco and you decided, hey, I could buy a house or I could start Uber, and I started Uber and now I'm a billionaire. Or I'm Jeff Bezos and I could buy a house, but instead I'm going to go live out of my parents' house and live out of their garage and start Amazon out of their garage and take all my money that I could be buying a home with and invest in a business. Now, is that the right situation for you? I don't know. It might be, it might not be. But I want to plant that seed that for everybody it is not the same. Before I ever bought a personal home residence, I bought a commercial property. I bought a business. So sometimes you want to invest in things that will give you a longer run, longer rate of return than a home. Now, there's another scenario, and I'm going to get into the next podcast, where if you're just out of college and you've got enough for a down payment and you're good with having roommates, then you can get your roommates to pay for your home for you. So regardless if it appreciates, you're going to pay almost nothing in rent. I have a friend that I play basketball with, and we were talking about this the other day. And I was asking him first about his student loan debt, and he said he had none. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. Good for you. How'd you do it? We had a discussion about that. And then I said, oh, okay, so what else you doing? And he goes, yeah, well, I bought a house. And now you got roommates? He goes, yeah, I bought a 4-bedroom house, and I have 3 roommates. So all 4 rooms are rented, 1 to myself, 3 rentals. And he said, I pay about $100 a month. So that is a great investment. Now realize, to create that income, he's sacrificing part of his lifestyle. How many of us want to live with three roommates? And in our 20s, probably doesn't bother us that much. But over the long term, if that house appreciates as he thinks that it will, when he doesn't want to be living there anymore, he can rent out his room as well. And now it could cash flow him. He could move out today and move into an apartment that costs $1,000 a month. And if he rents the room for $700, he has to pay $300, and now he lives on his own. And if that house appreciates enough, then he could rent it out as a 4-bedroom rental to a family and probably collect the same amount of rent, and pays for itself again. And as rents rise, he does better. But right now, that's a great scenario, and he's getting a huge advantage of leverage. So there's lots of scenarios that I want you to consider. There's no right or wrong answer. And that's the most important part. When I sat down with my friends when we first did this, the conventional wisdom was buying a house is the best investment that you can make. And me being me, I just asked the question, is that true? If it is, then so be it. And sometimes it is. If you can get a 3-bedroom house and get financed for that, and you have the credit, and you can get a low interest rate, and you can rent out 2 rooms, and that pays the majority of your rent, or you can buy a triplex, and you can rent out the two other apartments in it, and live in the other one, and reduce your rent because of that. And if that works for you, and you don't mind being the landlord, could be a great investment. On the other hand, if you have business opportunity where you could invest in a business that could return you a long-term, much higher rate of return, maybe that's the right answer. And there is no magic ball to see what these things are. But again, worksheets are built to figure it out. And now I'm going to go back and I'm going to fix this worksheet so that it works well for you, figure out what's wrong with it. But over the long, I know that most of it's pretty good because it's been used for a long time. But it did get tweaked because of the new tax law, and I'm sure a couple things got broken there. Happens all the time in Excel. And the other thing that I want you to do when you're using this worksheet is realize that there are a lot of assumptions put into this. And you have to. So every one of these yellows is an assumption. So price is not an assumption, and down payment's not an assumption. Those are just numbers you have to come up with. But interest rate, and will that be fixed and locked for the next 30 years? If you get a 30-year mortgage, then you're probably over on this worksheet, right? Property taxes may change. PMI could change or could be temporary. Either A, you're paying down the loan, or B, the home appreciates. And sometimes the PMI is locked in, though. A lot of times now they lock it in for a minimum of 5 years. Your insurance costs could rise, and your repair costs could rise. Your federal and state tax rates can fluctuate and typically go up, so sometimes the benefit goes up to you. But if you get married, if this was a married couple right here, then the standard deduction would be completely lost, so this tax benefit's gone. Or if your tax rate goes up, then the benefit to you, if it's there, might be even more. So there's a lot of interplay here. And I always want you to think, what if my assumptions are not correct? And which ones are the most likely that I'm going to err on? I don't think that if you put in a 7% rate of return on your money, that's really going to be an issue. I think that's likely to happen. That you'll get that if you buy an index fund over the long term, over 30 years. Any particular year could go up and down, some higher, some lower, but that's the typical average, and I think that'll probably maintain for the long term. The home appreciation rate, that one's always a guess, right? The cost to sell your home, that's probably a pretty standard cost. So I'm going to go fix this worksheet. Thanks for listening. Hope to catch you next time. Hope we've entertained you with a discussion about whether or not you should rent or buy a home, and I hope that you have some tools now to dig into it and make a really informed decision and do the best thing for you and your family. So thanks for listening. Catch you next time.